am the marketing manager at Bedford St. Martin's, and thank you for bearing with us with our technical difficulties. I want to welcome Amy Ziller and Liz Kleinfeld. And since I have such a terrible echo, I'm just going to give them the stage.
Good morning. My name is Amy Braziller, and I'm a professor of English at Red Rocks Community College, located just west of Denver, Colorado. I've been teaching at Red Rocks for approximately 17 years.
And I'm Liz Kleinfeld. I used to teach with Amy at Red Rocks for a number of years, and then in 2008 I took a job at Metro State University of Denver, and I direct the Writing Center and teach English there. We're going to cover quite a bit of ground today, so here's just a quick overview. We'll first talk about how we came to this multi-genre, multimodal approach, and we'll talk about some of the theoretical foundations of the book, the Bedford Book of Genres.
And then we're going to look at student benefits, look at ways that this approach helps students engage more and develop flexibility along with other things.
We'll then look at a few of the specific features of the textbook and talk about how those can be integrated into a course.
And then we'd like to take you back into the world of the classroom, looking at class activities, student projects, perhaps some resistance that you might encounter, and hopefully leave plenty of time for some questions.
So first, a little background to this project. When Amy and I taught together at Red Rocks, we talked all the time about how our teaching was going, and we both really loved writing and all aspects of composing. And we were sometimes frustrated that although we loved teaching composition, we felt like our students didn't love composing the way that we did. And so we were always having conversations about how we could try to convey to students how much fun and how much play can be involved in composing. And finally, in 2007, Amy went to 4Cs without me, and she came back and she said, Liz, I have to tell you about this multi-genre approach that I went to a presentation about. And so she and I started using a multi-genre approach, and we were really excited about how that affected our students. We felt like our students were finally understanding how much fun composing can be and really enjoying it the way that we do. So the book that we ended up writing and the approach that we take is really grounded in some of the theory that has a lot of traction in compositional rhetoric and writing studies right now. The book is really grounded in the concept of the rhetorical situation, which was first well articulated by Lloyd Bitzer in 1968. And it's just the idea that all communication takes place within a rhetorical context that involves an audience, a purpose, constraints, and an exigency. Transfer theory is something that is getting a lot of attention right now, and it's looking at how students transfer what they've learned in one situation to another situation. So ideally, if our composition courses are doing what we want them to do, students will be able to take what they've learned about composing in our classes and bring it to other composing situations they find themselves in outside of our classes. And some of the research on transfer has showed that metacognitive reflection is really key in allowing transfer to happen. And we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about how we've integrated the concept of metacognitive reflection into our teaching and the Bedford Book of Genres. And then finally, threshold concept theory is the idea that every discipline has discipline-specific concepts that a person must understand to make sense of the field. So an example of a threshold concept in our field would be that writing gets things done, that through writing something, you can persuade someone of something or inform someone of something. And you'll see when we talk later about some of the student projects, you'll see how evident it is that students are understanding that writing actually does get things done. The book is also well-grounded in the concept of 21st century literacies, and both the NCTE and the WPA have recognized that 21st century literacies include familiarity and flexibility with both genre and delivery mode. That top box of text is from the NCTE statement, which talks about how students practice multimodal literacies naturally And that's really key. We're capitalizing on something that students are already gravitating towards and wanting to learn more about with this approach. And then that statement goes on to say that students can be helped to understand how modal works make meaning, how they're based on conventions, and how they're created for and respond to specific communities or audiences. And I think you'll see as we go through the presentation how these things are manifesting in the student work that is produced. The bottom box that is headed with rhetorical knowledge is from the WPA outcomes. And what I want to highlight there is that the first sentence is rhetorical knowledge is the ability to analyze context and audiences and then to act on that analysis in comprehending and creating text. And you'll see that we're constantly asking our students to analyze context and audiences and to respond with genre choices that are specific to the context that they're composing in. And then that bulleted list there, the first item, learn and use key rhetorical concepts. Learn and use key rhetorical concepts through analyzing and composing a variety of texts. We'll be showing you a variety of different types of texts that students have created, and you'll see that this approach is just really flexible and allows teachers to emphasize particular genres if they want to, but also give students a lot of freedom to choose genres if the teacher has set up the class to be okay with that. And then the next couple bullet items we also will be touching on throughout our presentation, that students gain experience reading and composing in several genres, and that students develop facility in responding to a variety of rhetorical situations. There's a lot of different ways that an instructor could develop a syllabus with this approach. So what we're showing here is just one kind of generic syllabus that could be developed. The pie chart shows that students would be creating 5 individual genre pieces, 2 of them being wild card pieces where the student would have a complete choice about what genre they want to compose in. 20% of the grade would be made up of a final portfolio in which students revise all of the pieces that they've created. And then you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen how a typical 16-week semester could flow. So the first couple of weeks would be an intro to the course and the concept of genre. The next 3 weeks would be focused on narrative pieces, and that would emphasize helping students understand what narration does. And again, that gets to the idea that writing does things and how narration does those things. And students would be working really intensely with looking at samples of narrative genres and trying to figure out how those particular samples are responding to their rhetorical situations. And then students would be composing and workshopping their own draft. And then those same activities would occur in weeks 6 through 8 with a focus on informational pieces, and then again with weeks 9 through 11 with a focus on argumentative pieces. And then in weeks 12 through 15, the same process again, only students would be working on genre pieces of their choice, and then that final week could be focused on revising for the final portfolio.
We want to talk about student benefits now. And one of the ways that we want to look at it is we found that students tend to engage very deeply with the process. And one of the ways we've seen this through our teaching experience is that they're very invested in their learning. And we notice this by they ask a lot of questions. And the questions are really them puzzling through things and trying to understand their process perhaps, maybe source citation in unfamiliar genres. We also notice that they have a lot of ownership in their piece, and I want to talk about that via this piece by a student, Early, called The Weeping Pines. Early was doing research on the pine beetle in Colorado and its devastation. And he was also studying to be a park ranger. He was in that program, as well as had a background as a glass sculptor. So he wanted to represent his research in a sculpture. And you'll see there are 3 trees in it. The first tree is a very healthy one, and you can see perhaps, you might make out there's a little black bird on it. The second piece, not so healthy. It's more dwarf. The green leaves are now black. And finally, the third piece is kind of kaput. It's not great anymore. So we also noticed that, as you see, he's transforming knowledge. He's taken a lot of research that he's either done through observation or from reading, and he's created this piece so he really understands his research. Another thing we notice is that students know genres. I had a colleague recently tell me a story about a student. She said the student came up to her after class and said, I want to tell you something. I was watching The Voice the other night, and they used the word genre. So the students really are familiar with genre. So we want to take you through the assignment and the scaffolding that got Harley to the place he was at. So as Liz mentioned with the syllabus, the students here were creating a primarily informational piece, although we always talk about that purposes aren't static and limited, that there can be sub-purposes. And Harley had that because not only was he maybe even narrating a story of this is what happens along the way, but there's also, as we all know, elements of persuasion and telling people, hey, this is an issue that we need to be aware of. So that was the assignment, to create an informational genre piece that really used some of the research. Accompanying that was what we call an artist-author statement, and in that we wanted the students in a 2 to 4 page persuasive essay to articulate their rhetorical choices that they made in composing the piece to help us understand who's the audience, who's your purpose and the intended effects, perhaps how did you use sources, how did you use your research, why that genre, and articulate it. So to get students to that point, their first assignment outside of class was to examine other genres whose primary purpose was to inform. And one of the ways I did this was through chapter 3 in the text at the readings. Students would answer some of the questions after the readings in an online discussion area. Then when we met in class again, students would follow the steps in chapter 8 for choosing their genre that they wanted to compose. And I asked them initially to focus on perhaps 3 genres that could meet their rhetorical situation. I put them in small groups to talk to classmates about their choices and to help each other kind of choose, is this the best one for reaching your audience in the way you want to, for achieving your purpose. In the following class periods, I would ask students to bring in a few examples of genre pieces they chose. So if they chose to, let's say, use an infographic, I'd want them to bring in examples of infographics, and they would present these to the class and in small groups discussing the genre's conventions. A week later, they'd bring in a draft of their genre creation and their artist statement to workshop with other students, and I did peer workshops a little differently than I might without genre-based compositions. I had students get in groups based on the mode they were privileging. So for instance, if a student had mostly visuals, I'd put those students together in a group. And then ultimately students would polish this and submit it to me. So oftentimes it's puzzling, how do we grade such a piece? And this was my grading criteria. And as you see with the genre piece, I say the piece meets the conventions of the genre. I am not a visual artist. I'm not a sculptor. So you might go, well, how do you know that? And the way I know that is through the artist statement. And I want to share with you little bits from Harley's artist statement, and that will help you see how I can understand what a student's trying to do in the work. So he said, the first idea that came to me was to create a landscape painting to show a mountain scene that has been affected by the mountain pine beetle. I wanted to do this in the style of a famous PBS painter, Bob Ross, but instead of painting happy trees, my idea was to show the sad trees that are dead and dying. Alas, I have no prior experience painting, nor do I have the necessary supplies to do a proper painting. Since I do have experience and access to black sculpture supplies and techniques, I felt I could better express my ideas through a sculpture. He then goes on and discusses making a trip up to Grand Lake, Colorado, where there's been a lot of this devastation, to observe it firsthand. He incorporated research from the National Park Service related to this issue. And his statement also discusses the actual process of putting the project together. For example, when sculpting the logical pine, I used an iPhone app called Tree ID to see scientific interpretation of the shape and silhouette of the tree. Later on, he discusses his rhetorical appeals and says, in appealing to ethos, I hope that the audience notices my wildlife selection. The woodpecker shows the audience that he is feeding on the insects below the bark. The squirrel, which lives in trees, is upset and worried looking because his tree is dying and food is becoming scarce. And the dead tree has a single crow, ugly, and cawing his tune of death. So you see, through the artist's statement, it really helps me see what the student is trying to do and achieve.
I'm going to talk now about how this approach helps students develop flexibility. And we've noticed that our students, because we're always emphasizing to them that they need to first think about their rhetorical situation, figure out what it is, the message that they want to get across and who they want to get it across to, and then think about what are some genres that would allow them to do that. And so it's normally not immediately clear-cut to students which genre they should be working in, and they'll normally consider 2 or 3 genres before committing to one. And so that helps them understand that they have choices to make and that they're ultimately responsible for the choices that they do make. And it also helps them build a repertoire of composing strategies, because as they're thinking about whether they want to compose in the genre of say, public service announcements, they have to think about, well, what would it take to compose a public service announcement? And do I have enough time to do that? And they might ultimately decide, no, that's not going to work for me. Maybe instead I'm going to write an informative blog piece. So you see a picture here of a student of mine named Neil. He, over the course of the semester, created 5 genre projects around the topic of video games and violence. And you'll see that odd-looking piece of technology that's actually a microcassette recorder. And one of the genre pieces that Neil created was an audio diary of a truant officer. And his idea was that there was a high school student who had stopped attending classes, and the truant officer was following the student to find out what he was doing in lieu of going to class. And as you listen to the audio diary, you find out that what this student is doing is sitting in his dad's basement playing video games all day. Below that, you see a piece that is formatted like a play script. And in fact, this demonstrates something I was saying about students considering multiple genres. Neil initially wanted to create a film that would dramatically demonstrate a confrontation between a father and son about the son playing video games all the time. And so that was what Neil planned to do until he realized that creating a really good film takes a lot more time than Neil had in the semester. And so he then changed his genre choice to a script for a film. And so that was what he ultimately created. To give you a sense of the assignment that Neil was responding to, it was real similar to the assignment that Amy described, the key difference being the second bullet item from the bottom. I asked students to submit a written proposal for each project that they created. And in that proposal, they had to talk about the rhetorical situation that they were composing within, and then talk about the different genres that they were considering. And then ultimately, by the end of the proposal, they were to commit to one genre and articulate the reasons that they were going to go with that genre rather than the other genres that they had considered. And so then when it came time to grade, I used a scheme similar to Amy's, but the proposal was worth 10 points. And the proposal included an annotated example of the genre. And those annotated examples of the genre are based on something that we'll talk about soon a feature of the book is called guided reading, and these are basically annotated examples of genre pieces. So students were creating their own annotated examples, kind of mimicking what they saw in the book.
Another thing we found is that students compose for authentic rhetorical situations, and they really think about choosing their audience or where their audience might come across their work. So this student, Emily, was very interested in the situation in North Korea, and she did a project called Generation of Hope, a look at today's North Korea. And when she was putting together her entire project at the end of the semester, she had composed multiple genres. She thought about, how do I want to reach my audience? And her audience were students about her age who needed to know about this. And as you see, she said, you know, I use Tumblr to get my information about current events, so therefore I want to post my project on a Tumblr blog. So we find it's really great when students are thinking through their compositions and realizing, you know what, my audience is not really my teacher or the students in the class. I can create for a real world audience.
One of the other aspects of this approach that Amy and I are really excited about is that students use research the way that we want them to use research, rather than just simply going through the motions of having an attitude of, well, I guess I'll do some research because the assignment says I have to. And then the student just does a Google search on their topic and snags the first 5 or 6 sources that come up, and those are by default the sources the student relies on. What happens instead is that students, because they're reading sample genres so closely, they're noticing how sources are used within those genres, and they start to pick up on how research is used to discover something, to discover information, or to learn new perspectives that you're actually interested in. So one of the things that happens is that students begin engaging with research that helps them understand a topic from different perspectives. So instead of just looking for sources that support the arguments that they want to make or the position that they want to take, they're looking at sources that will help them understand a particular event from the perspectives of different types of people who might be involved in that event. So, for example, when students might be researching a natural disaster, they might look at news sources to get a sense of what are the facts, what was the magnitude of that earthquake, or how many buildings were destroyed in that hurricane. But then they'll also often read blog entries that were written by people who were part of that natural disaster. And so they'll get the personal story from the woman whose home was destroyed or something like that. Students also start to understand that sources are cited not just because a teacher told someone to cite a source, but because readers will ideally get so invested in what you've written that they want to do more research and they want to find the sources that you referred to. So what you see on your screen is a slide from a PowerPoint show that my student Mackenzie made. She was interested in finding out about how slam poets compose poems, and wanted to know if the processes that they used for composing their poems was similar or different from the processes that she used to compose academic papers, but also short stories that she writes. And so she ultimately decided that she wanted to talk to slam poets themselves to get their perspective, not just find out what others have said about slam poets, but find out from them how they compose things. And so what you see on that slide is some questions that she put in a survey that she distributed to 20 different slam poets, and she ended up getting responses from, I think it was 8 or 9, who were actually happy to talk with her about their processes.
Here you see the textbook, the Bedford Book of Genres, and you can see on the right-hand side a list of some of the different genres that the textbook covers. And the difference between the guide and the reader, they're identical for chapters 1 through 10, and then the reader has 4 additional chapters that focus on different themes such as identity and heroes and villains that have reasons in different genres. So we want to take you through a bit of the text and show you how that can support this approach. As Liz showed in the syllabus, the sample syllabus, we always like to start with Chapter 1, which is an introduction to genres. For some students, with the introduction to the rhetorical situation, it might be a review, or for some it may be something that they've never thought about. So it introduces students to the concepts of purpose, what are some different purposes a piece could have, audience, what does it mean to have a primary audience, a secondary audience, rhetorical appeal. It also looks at genre convention. How do you look at a piece and sort of dissect it to not only understand what the composer is doing, but also how you might compose in it? So it looks at perhaps elements of style, the design of the piece, the sources, and then the chapter focuses on a case study of looking at one event through two different genres. And the one that's featured in the text is the arch wall collapse that happened in Arches National Park a number of years ago. And it looks at both a press release and a blog post that we have pictured here. And one of the nice things is students can look at them side by side and look at how are similar messages conveyed. How do these two different writers establish their ethos? And what was interesting in looking at how an event can be presented in multiple genres, one student recently wrote and said, it would be interesting to look at the events in Ferguson and how could that be represented in different ways through different genres.
Another feature of the book are 18 guided readings throughout the book, and we're showing one that's a guided reading of an advertisement for bottled water. But this one illustrates what we do in all of the guided readings. There are annotations that are highlighting the purpose of the piece, who the target audience is, and how that target audience is how the composer is building rapport with that audience, how rhetorical appeals are used, and then specific aspects of the genre conventions for that particular genre. And some of the guided readings include a press release, a blog post, a collage, a literacy narrative, a photo essay, an infographic, and a researched argument. And you might recall me saying earlier that when my students write their proposals, they have to include an annotated example of the genre that they plan to work in. And I ask them to use these guided readings as a model for that.
Another feature in the text is guided processes and really a student presence in the text. We found that having professional published pieces is really helpful for students to see those as models, but students also want to see how do other students go through the same process, these assignments. So these walk students through the steps that others have taken, the research, compose, and revise in different genres. So seeing how other students have worked through the process makes these concepts more concrete for students and gives them a framework for their own work. These guided processes also provide scaffolding to help students move, let's say, from an earlier stage of a project to more sophisticated ones. So here we have a guided process that shows how a student, Gwen, decided upon, the beginnings of what should I do? And as you see here, she's just, brainstorming her project to start with. She talks about, I have this rough draft, I've looked at an argument, I've read some of the things, and she's really going through her ideas to narrow things more to get a better sense of how do I proceed with my project.
We mentioned near the beginning when we were talking about the theoretical underpinnings, we talked about metacognitive reflection and how that has been integrated into the book. The main vehicle for that is asking students to write an author's or artist's statement after they compose each of their genre pieces. And we actually have a guided reading of an artist's statement So that's one that's totally annotated and helps students understand how this genre works. And as students compose their own, they're reflecting on the choices that they made and thinking about things that they considered doing and ultimately decided not to do or changed their mind about, and they're articulating why, and then they're talking through the consequences of the choices that they've made.
Okay, so now what we'd like to do is go over briefly some class activities. So one of the things that the book has throughout are informal assignments, and what we're calling informal assignments are these little bubbles that appear. So for example, as the students are about to get into analyzing the two different pieces about the arch collapse, you might have them think of a current issue, and perhaps, this is where the student came up with Ferguson, how is that covered differently if they're watching it on the news, if they're reading a tweet about it? What does that say about the event? And it just starts to get students thinking about the topic you're covering.
After each of the readings in the book, there's a set of questions that help students analyze the reading using the same ideas that we've been talking about throughout the book. So we're asking them to analyze the rhetorical situation that this piece was composed within. So we have an excerpt in the book from Richard Rodriguez's Hunger of Memory, and here's the set of questions that follows that reading. And you can see from the bolded words at the beginning of each question that the questions are prompting students to think through purpose and audience and rhetorical appeals, but also the modes in the media and particular aspects of how courses are used and how the style of the writing affects the reader and helps to achieve the purpose that the writer set out to achieve.
So something that goes a little bit more in depth than, let's say, the informal things are what are called starter projects. And these starter projects are only in the reading chapters. And this one is at the beginning of Heroes and Villains. And it's, again, similar to the informal assignment. It's a way for students to really start digging into the information. So for this, one of the projects might be, as you see in number 3, a portrait of a villain. So it asks students to go out on all of our favorite search engines, Google, and look for, villains, let's say in popular culture, maybe in their gaming community, in the news, and look at them, notice the patterns that are happening. Are there things that are similar that they're seeing? And then maybe to dig a bit deeper, what do these images say about our society, about people's attitudes? So we have a range for each of the reading chapters, starter projects to get students really thinking about the theme.
And then we also have composing projects throughout the book, and these are prompts that would get students thinking about topics or issues that have been raised in the readings in that chapter, and then give them ideas for pieces that they could compose in response in some way to what they've been reading. So, for example, in the corporate greening section of the environment chapter, we have some assignments that ask students to do things like create a spoof ad or craft a memo and a PR message. And if you look at that one, number 7, it's asking students to imagine that they're the head of a major corporation and they need to address aspects of their image that are problematic in terms of greenness. So they need to address those issues in a business and marketing plan. And then they need to deal with that issue to different constituent groups, so to the workforce, to consumers. And as students are thinking about that, they're realizing that they're going to have to use different types of genres to get their message across to different audiences. So even if they have the same purpose, because the audience changes, the genre might change.
So now we've shown you some student work, and we just want to close out with showing you a few more pieces of student work so you can see what our students are doing. So Nicole, who is a student of mine, she was doing research on vaccinations and you know, why I should vaccinate. Should I vaccinate my child? And her motivation was she had lots of friends who were not vaccinating, and she wanted to understand why and really persuade them that they needed to. So she created as one of her pieces this advertisement, very clever. We had talked about ethos throughout the course, and so she wanted to create a URL, a place to get the facts, and she talked about herd immunity. And at the end of the semester, she put all the pieces together in this magazine that she created, and she called the magazine A Place on All Our Houses.
This is a project that my student Ryan created. He was an avid gamer, and he made all of his projects during the semester revolve around gaming in some way. And at some point, he became really interested in how different video games draw in different ways on pop culture, on different myths, on different storytelling conventions. And he decided that he wanted one of his projects to be a continuum in which he categorized different games in terms of how much remix he thought they were engaging in. And he ultimately created a Prezi that presented his findings or his interpretation of how much remix these games were using. And he initially told me that his audience was gamers like himself. And I said, well, Ryan, how many gamers like yourself would actually be interested in a continuum like this? And how many actually would go to your Prezi? And he said, probably none. I'm probably the only one who actually cares about it this much. So we started talking about how his initial audience choice of gamers was probably not really a realistic one. And he started thinking more about, well, who would be interested in this continuum? And so he ultimately changed his audience to geeky gamer scholars. And then because he was then gearing his work towards scholars, he realized that he had to go back to the Prezi and revise it to make all of the language a little more scholarly, because he initially was using language that would appeal to other gamers like himself. But once he realized he was writing to scholars, he realized he was going to need to elevate the diction a little bit and maybe bust out his thesaurus and use a few more multisyllabic words.
And the last snippet of a project we want to show you is by ALYXX. ALYXX was a student of mine who was extremely nervous, and very early in the semester when she was choosing her topic, she came up to me and she said, I want to do it on social anxiety, and I could tell that it was probably something she suffered from, and I said, are you comfortable with this? She said, yeah, I really actually want to understand this more for myself. So for this particular project, she was doing a narrative piece, and we had looked at some fairy tales, and she was like, oh, I want to do a parody. So she did several different graphic panels that she called The Three Little Pigs and the Not So Bad Wolf. And she had, her audience was essentially people like her, and, you know, she made it a little younger because she wanted it really to kind of be tweens. So as you see, the language is a little bit more than you wouldn't have an 8-year-old perhaps reading about drugs and alcohol on the couch.
And before we open it up to questions, we thought it would be important to talk about some of the myths and realities of teaching composition with a multi-genre approach. And first I'll mention that there is an instructor's manual for the book that can help with you figuring out how to structure your course and how to assess the pieces that your students are creating. And so one of the main places of resistance is the idea that you have to be an expert in any genre or mode that a student might compose in. And Amy and I laugh all the time about how non-expert we are about some of the genres that our students compose in. And the truth is that the students become experts in that genre. And then through the proposal, if you have them write one, and through the artist and author's statements, the students articulate to you what the key aspects of those genres are. So you don't have to be an expert at the beginning. You have to put that responsibility and accountability on the students, and they've learned from that. The next myth is that you have to be a techno-whiz. And in fact, you might have noticed from Neil's project with that micro cassette recorder, he was not a techno-whiz. He was someone who actually, I suspect, probably collected archaic technology. Yeah, I think he composed some of his papers on an actual typewriter rather than a word processor. It's totally possible for students to create low-tech projects. And some students create very high-tech projects, but many don't. And it's most of the time, I don't have to provide very much technical support for students. And I often tell them when I'm giving an assignment, I won't be able to provide much technical support beyond my regularly scheduled office hours and the knowledge that I already have about particular technologies or genres. So take that into account when you're deciding on the genre you want to compose in. There's also sometimes concern that students won't write enough, and this is, again, something Amy and I laugh about. Our students are almost always complaining at some point during the semester that they have spoken to someone, a friend of theirs who's taking another section of first-year composition, who's not writing nearly as much as they are in our classes. And that's because of those authors and artist statements that have students articulate all of the authorial choices that they're making. And then finally, sometimes people are concerned that students won't learn what they need to be successful in their other writing classes. And the thing is, with this approach, you treat the academic essay and the academic research paper as other genres. And so students do sometimes choose those genres, but they're not choosing them by default. They're choosing them through a careful analysis of their rhetorical situation. And even if a student never does choose to write in those genres, they're still learning how to analyze a rhetorical situation, which is something that they can apply to any communication situation in any class, in any workplace, in any situation that they find themselves in.
So we hope you have some questions for us, and we sincerely hope we can answer them for you.
Hey, Amy and Liz, we have our first question. They ask, what do your students think about your approach? Are they confused or resistant at first? And how do you persuade them?
Well, you know, there's a range. Sometimes you will have students. I was actually observing a colleague's class recently, and I was just chatting with some students. I'm like, hey, do you really like this approach? And they looked at me and they're like, I'd rather write a research paper. And I'm like, why? They said, it's easier. So right there, I was like, oh, well, that's not a good enough reason. But one of the things I tell my students is it may seem really chaotic at first. You might be a little confused, but trust me. And then I try to bring it back to them about things they already know. Compare it maybe to writing that they've done before.
Yeah, and I would just echo everything Amy said. I don't think I have any more resistance to this approach than I do to a more traditional approach. There are always students who wish they didn't have to take first-year comp, and the students who are in my classes become so engaged in the projects they're working on that I think they just forget that they were initially confused, if they were confused. And I do think that there is some confusion sometimes because students might think, well, I thought this was a class in writing essays. And so I do find that it's helpful on the first day of class to, in pretty great detail, go over the course outcomes and help students connect those outcomes to the types of composing that they'll be doing in the course.
Okay. Jessica asks, how do you incorporate revision into the composing process for each project? And how do you steer students away from genres that won't serve the rhetorical situation?
Okay, so one of the ways with revision, as I mentioned, students are initially workshopping together with their drafts. So sometimes they'll even just bring in their ideas first, and they'll do some of their brainstorming together and share their potential. And then when they actually bring in their pieces, they'll get feedback from each other, and then they'll have time to revise it, and then they'll submit it to me, and they'll get a grade, but they get extensive feedback because the idea is they're revising it for the end of the semester where they're going to put all the pieces together.
And I do the same thing. My students, that sample syllabus that I showed at the beginning with the 5 genre projects, each worth 10% each, that's pretty much what I do. And so it's kind of low stakes. Each one is just worth 10%, and then they spend the last week of the semester revising 3 of those projects, and they turn those 3 revised projects in as part of a portfolio that's worth 20%. And so they do revise the projects initially when they're working on them just for the little 10% part of their grade, but then they revise them again at the end of the semester when they can take the benefit of everything they've learned all semester into account. And sometimes when they're doing that final revision at the end of the semester, they'll change genre choices again. And they do that knowing full well that that's probably going to create more work for them, but they'll often decide that it's worth it because they really think they can deal with their rhetorical situation more effectively with a different genre choice.
Can you repeat the second part of the question, Emily?
Yes. How do you steer students away from genres that won't serve the rhetorical situation?
You know, I talked about Ryan initially having to change his audience because he wanted to talk to gamers. And initially, I tried to steer him toward a different genre. I said to him, if you want to talk to gamers, maybe let's think about a different genre that would be more appropriate than a Prezi that shows a continuum on it. And maybe gamers want to play a game that would help them get this information. And so we had an extensive conversation. We had some of that conversation in my office hours, but most of that conversation we had through emails. And ultimately, he decided that he wanted to stick with the genre and change the audience. But it's the same type of conversation. You ask questions like, is that a genre that the audience you're writing towards would actually pick up and read? Is it a genre they would actually come across in their everyday life? And if it's not, it doesn't really matter how effective your message is because it's never going to be seen by the people who you hope will see it.
And sometimes students recognize this for themselves. I'll have students come into class and go, oh, I had to start all over because I was composing, and I realized this isn't going to fit my situation. There is no way my audience comes across this. And even though they may be a little frustrated about doing extra work, it's wonderful to see because they realize it without me saying it, and they've just taken it upon themselves to redo it so it's really authentically matching their situation.
Okay, Amy, we have a few more questions, so I'm going to move on. Let's see. Hold on one second. The first one is, do you have any kind of rubric for how you evaluate the genre process and/or art statement? I like this approach, but the assessment component feels the most intimidating.
So yeah, I use a basic rubric for the genres, and as when I went over the piece of how I scaffolded Harley's piece, it kind of breaks down some of the things. So for example, I look at things like, does it meet the conventions? And as I said, so if they are composing, let's say, a blog, and it doesn't have, it just looks like straight text on a page, I may take off points there because maybe there's no hyperlink or it doesn't even appear that the student has tried to understand the conventions of it. So I'm looking really at their understanding of the conventions of the piece. If, let's say, a student puts a source citation in the middle with, let's say, MLA citation in the middle of a brochure, I may not take off a lot of points, but I might comment to the student, is there a better way to attribute that information that's keeping within it? I also look at, does it meet the purpose and audience? And the way I can find that out is through the artist statement. The artist statement, again, I do use a clear rubric that really, do they hit on the points? Do I understand their rhetorical appeal? Do I understand why they've chosen this particular genre to compose in? Do I understand their audience and how they've reached the audience? And again, in the artist statement, they're practicing their writing skills. So if they're not supporting their argument, their point, like let's say, I heavily privilege ethos, but they don't tell me how, I will deduct points for that because I want them to support their ideas. In that they're not only telling me they understand what they're doing, that metacognitive part, but they're also showing me good writing skills by supporting their ideas with developed examples.
And Emily, correct me if I'm wrong. I think you or someone else were collecting some rubrics and assignments and things like that that would be available as a resource for anyone who wants help with this.
Absolutely, and we posted a connection to the sample syllabi in the chat feature. But I want to go ahead and move on because we have some more questions. So Kelly asks, does this approach work with a diverse student body? She said she teaches at a community college where students are reluctant to engage. Some of them are in their 40s to 50s and have limited technology problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Amy teaches at a community college, and Metro State, where I teach, has an extremely diverse student body. I have, in my composition classes, I normally have a range of students from early 20s into their 40s and 50s, and a lot of them are really, they would rather do a traditional approach just because it's more comfortable to them, and some of them are a little technophobic, or they just have limited technology available to them, and so it works really well with them. Those students, I would say the non-traditional students, are often the ones that are most excited around midterm when they have realized that this approach is actually going to be much more effective for them to learn how to communicate in a workplace, or a lot of them will say things like, well, this is going to help me with the scrapbooking that I'm doing for my grandkids or something like that. So they're finding that what they're learning is really applicable to the things that they're interested in, to the communication situations that they're interested in participating in outside of the class.
Right. I had a student in her late 40s, and she was a healthcare worker retraining, and she focused her topic, it's still very memorable because it was maggot therapy. And she is not a big technology user, and at first she'd always come up to me going, I can't do technology. I'm like, April, you don't have to do technology. So she did a traditional essay for one of her pieces. She did a poster that she put together. And at the end, the way she packaged her project together, she got really excited. She's like, I'm going to put all the pieces in the doctor's bag because that is my audience for the piece.
Okay, great. We have a question. Do you integrate the library and/or information literacy into this type of instruction?
It depends. The book could be used for a first semester class that doesn't give attention to research. Although when I teach that class, I always have my students doing primary research of some sort. But the book could also be used in a second semester class or a class that does focus more explicitly on library research. And one of the guided readings is of a research essay, and there is support within the book for students doing research. And when I teach that course, I do have my students do a kind of traditional library tour and that kind of thing.
Right, and I always, if I'm teaching research as an aspect of the course, which I often am, I'll have the librarian come in and do an overview of how to use EBSCOhost and other scholarly sources. So students are doing traditional research in terms of understanding different ways we acquire sources and the wide gamut from academic sources to maybe more popular sources.
And then the last question I have is, speaking of the portfolio, how do you hold students accountable for implementing your suggestions and peer suggestions?
I think that that's an issue with any approach that you take. And I tell my students that their job as an author is to consider all the feedback that they've gotten from readers, myself, their peers in class, writing center tutors, anyone else. And they need to consider that response, and then they need to decide whether they're going to do what the reader has suggested, or ignore what the reader has suggested, or find a third option. And when they turn the portfolio in, they turn in a reflection in which they talk about how they used the response that they got. And oftentimes they don't use or they don't implement the feedback that I gave them, but they articulate reasonable reasons for not having done that. And sometimes they'll admit, this was a really interesting suggestion that you had for me, Liz, and I wish I had had the time and energy to fully implement it, but I didn't. And so with that kind of statement, they're being accountable for an authorial decision that they made.
Right, and students, as we mentioned early on, they really become invested in their work. They are quite proud of their work. Our school has a scholarly academic journal, and each semester I have 2 to 3 students whose projects are published in that because they are superior sometimes in what they're able to produce. And they want to show off what they can do in a good way, not in this bragging way. So I find for the most part they are really motivated to do the best they can, and of course there will always be students who are just not interested, and I don't concern myself with that.
Well, we want to thank all of you for your interactivity, and especially to Amy and Liz for their time. I dropped my email address into the chat box. If you didn't get a question answered, or if you have more questions for us, feel free to send me an email and we can get that answered for you. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.